Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium. Before we begin today's colloquium, I would like to acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory University and JWJI seek to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to the respectful stewardship of the land. For those of you who celebrate Valentine's Day, happy Valentine's Day. So in honor of Valentine's Day, I wanted to announce the launch of a new initiative from JWJI. You may have seen it on our website, and so we're still working on the presentation on the website, but we're launching a faculty spotlight series, which is a webcast with interviews with Emory faculty who are publishing books on race. And so we've chosen Valentine's Day to launch this because our first webcast is with Dr. Diane Stewart in the Religious Studies and African American Studies Department. And so I did a conversation with her last year on her book, Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African American Marriage. So I think it's a really timely discussion. And so I hope that you get a chance to watch it and enjoy it. You can find it right now on Emory's YouTube channel. And so if you look, it should be sort of pretty clear there. So that should help you in terms of finding that webcast. And thanks to those who already have. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Niambi Carter, to the colloquium. Dr. Niambi Carter earned her bachelor's degree from Temple University and her PhD in political science from Duke University in 2007. Her research focuses on American politics with a specific focus on race, ethnicity, and politics, Black politics, public opinion, and political behavior. She's the author of the award-winning book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship, which investigates Black public opinion on immigration. She's also actively involved in other work that examines sanctuary cities, lynching, and race in American politics, and the political ideology of African American Republicans. Her work has appeared in numerous journals, including the Journal of Politics, Political Psychology, Politics, Groups, and Identities, the Journal of Women, Politics, and Policy, the Du Bois Review, and Politics and Gender, among others. She's the recipient of a number of fellowships and awards from organizations such as the Ford Foundation, the Consortium for Faculty Diversity, and the Center for the Study of African American Politics. So she joins us from Prince George's County, Maryland, where she grew up. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Niambi Carter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie. Happy Black History Month, everyone. And thank you for having me. And I definitely want to thank Rhonda and the other Antoinette, I think, and some others that were really helpful to me over the last few months in putting this together and organizing this conversation. And thank you to all the fellows for showing up a bit early and staying for the talk. It was great to dialogue with you this morning. And I want to talk to you about sort of what my research is going to be about. So let's see. So I hope you all can see the talk now. So my talk is entitled Finding Freedom, Back to Africa Movements and Black Immigration. And this is really a part of the book that didn't quite make it, if you will. And the talk is roughly going to sort of go over what the big questions are coming into this, sort of what my argument is or my thesis, and trying to take stock of Back to Africa movements and how we might think about them in a contemporary manner, and just some of my preliminary thoughts about it. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So let me know if I'm running over on time or if I'm talking too much. So my big questions are why back to Africa movements, right? And in particular, why are they so poorly understood in political science? And what can we learn by understanding these, quote, failures of Black nationalism? And in particular, I want to understand what Black immigration tells us about Black self-determination in the US and globally. And then what can it also help us understand about contemporary civil rights and the status of Black politics? Um, and I think it goes without saying the continued importance of Black nationalist movements. So the argument for why do this, or sort of the big reason why I want to do this, is we've been having conversations over the last few years around Brexit. I don't know if you all remember this from like 2016, where Black people were talking about leaving the United States if Donald Trump won the election of 2016, and the things that they would take with them. And while it was sort of an internet joke and all of that kind of stuff, it really did bring to mind this sort of larger narrative that we have about Black migration that I think sometimes we leave on the table when we're talking about options for Black political agency in particular. And I really thought about this as bringing, Black people from the margins to the centers in our discussions around immigration. We often talk about Black people as if they're only reacting to immigration and not as if they thought of immigration for themselves, right? And so part of the impetus for this work was really thinking about Back to Africa movements more particularly as being something more robust and more successful perhaps than we considered, because Blacks were moving around even as non-citizens. And I argue, even if we think about, say, the Great Migration, which we largely cordon off as sort of a domestic set of movements, what we're really seeing is part of this sort of larger global process of Black people using immigration as a way to enhance their status in the United States. So what I'm trying to do with this particular project is rethink Back to Africa movements. And in particular, I'm using the quotes of Back to Africa because really, what are these things about, right? It's not really about going to Africa in particular, excuse me. If we do, we'll see that these movements were ultimately unsuccessful, and we'll brand them as failures, right? Because we say, well, not that many Black people actually left the US for Africa. But that's only if we think about Africa as the end goal. The goal was freedom, and Black people were willing to move to find that freedom. Sometimes that meant within the US, but that also meant Canada. And that's where I'm sort of situating this work, that Back to Africa is really a stand-in and a metaphor for space that would allow Black people to be, right? And for this reason, Canada was the most common choice because it was proximate to the US. It had climate that was similar. The language is similar. It had relatively lax immigration policy where Black people were concerned, but it was also a place where Black people could kind of keep an eye on the United States and think about either returning to the US or working on behalf of Black people still enslaved in the US. So I'm thinking of this in this light, right? These Back to Africa movements in this light. And these are far from failures, but should be considered as viable political strategy that help Black people withstand white supremacy through some of their darkest times. So sorry, I think I've already did this a little bit more. So what is the sort of problem here that needs to be figured out, right? And one of the main ones, what to do with free Black people. Instead of white supremacy being organized or thought about as a problem, the organization was around removing free Black people from the United States during the enslavement period, right? Because there was some notion that Black people would be dangerous, right, to the sanctity and the ongoing enslavement of this country and our very deep imbrication in this enslavement. And these conceptualizations of Black people as the problem was sort of how we get organizations like the American Colonization Society, which starts as an idea, right, of segregationists, enslavers, and even philanthropists who thought that it would make more sense for Black people to be repatriated to the continent of Africa rather than to stay in the US, right? So rather than revise what the US is, we'll just take the problem away, which is Black people. And in so doing, this sort of organization, this sort of notion about how we were going to approach Black people about leaving the United States really missed what Black people were after and did not understand why Black people, by and large, wouldn't leave, right? Because the locus of the problem was all wrong. And I know that Louis Farrakhan is probably not someone that we think of often here, but Louis Farrakhan in a 1997 interview with Tim Russert on Meet the Press gave a very powerful articulation of this notion. So I'm going to try to play a little of it here. Hopefully it'll play. And I hope you all can hear it. I put the captions on.
Thank you, honored to be here. Bob Novak heard you speak in Florida recently and wrote a column entitled Farrakhan and the GOP. And he said that Farrakhan is knocking on the door of the Republican Party, the first modern Black leader to do so. But who will open the door and sit down and talk to him? You just heard John Kasich, whom you praised. Jack Kemp last night said it's impossible to sit down with you because of things you said. Are you trying to reach out and play a role in the Republican Party?
First, let me say that when men of high political standing say that it is impossible to sit down with Farrakhan because of the things he has said, should I then say it is impossible to sit down with white people for the things that they have done? I speak words and I believe my words are truth, but what my people have suffered and continue to suffer in America is very real. So if there's going to be some meeting of the minds, intelligent people should sit down, pardon me, and not give me preconditions, but sit down and talk about the future of this nation and the future of suffering people in America.
In preparing for this interview, I read the literature that your organization puts out and publishes, and I'd like to go through some of it to find out what you believe and how it affects America. This is your newspaper, which comes out once a month. And on the back page, once a week, in the back page is the Muslim program, What the Muslims Want. And if I could go through a few of these, let me put one on the screen and get your reaction. The first is in terms of territory. And you'll see, since we cannot get along with them in peace and equality, we believe our contributions to this land and the suffering forced upon us by white America justifies our demand for complete separation in a state or territory of our own. Is that your view in 1997, a separate state for Black Americans?
First, the program starts with number one. That is number 4. The first part of that program is that we want freedom, a full and complete freedom. And the second is we want justice, and we want equal justice under the law, and we want justice applied equally to all, regardless of race or class or color. And the third is that we want equality. We want equal membership in society with the best in civilized society. If we can get that within the political, economic, social system of America, there's no need for point number 4.
So I showed this little piece because what he is articulating is very much a sentiment of a previous generation, right, of a previous century, in the 19th century, where Black people are really trying to push back against this idea that they are the locus of the issue and make America live up to its promise. But there were also some who said, we know what America will and will not do, right? And that we don't see any hope here. And so we've done sort of what Minister Farrakhan said, which is try to get 1 through 3 here. And so now we are on 4, which means that we need to think about leaving this United States. And getting to Canada as part of this was not necessarily that far afield. Black people have been going into Canada for a very long time at this point, right? Since the early part of the 19th century, starting with some of the Black loyalist later 18th century, the Black loyalist post the Revolution, the American Revolution, and then later the War 1812 and others. But we see that Black had already created these well-worn routes around the US, trying to escape enslavement, even routes going down into Mexico. But Canada became sort of the beacon, right? Because Blacks could earn a living, own land, and vote in Canada, right? And so what we see in these sort of moments in the 19th century, these early parts of the 19th century, are Black people really struggling with what to do, right? Because there are these forces, right, that are pushing Blacks out, right, of the South, but there are also forces that want Blacks just out of the country, period, right? And so we see these creations of these colonies on the continent with the notion that Black people would be comfortable there, that if Black people were out of the hair, free Black people were out of the hair of white Americans, then everyone's life would be better. Now, of course, we know this isn't true, and Black people themselves had a critique of all of these efforts, because how could we expect a government that would keep Black people in bondage to then be the very same people to sponsor their freedom? It didn't make sense. And Black people didn't necessarily think that any of these schemes, whether done by Britain or the US or any of these other organizations, were really sincere. What it was just another way to remove Black people, but also where the colonies were located, to extract and hurt the native Black people there, right? So that these were, I believe it was Martin Delaney called it a burlesque, right, of a government in these spaces. And so Black people were very reticent to relocate, particularly because a lot of this was going to be sponsored by the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society really tried to do two things at once. It was sort of talking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, they were treating this as it was sort of, alms, right, for free Blacks who were finding themselves having a difficulty, right, living in the US because of the racism, etc. On the other, this was really about white people being able to continue enslavement without the specter of free Black people who would either make their enslaved persons think about freedom, or would potentially help their enslaved brethren plot revolts, and who would deign to request all of the things that free people would have in US, like citizenship, like access to the ballot, etc. But then there was also the segregationist side of this, who just had a real disdain for Black people and did not imagine Black people as being fully participatory members of American society. And Henry Clay, the noted enslaver and segregationist, said Black people, these free Black people, were useless and pernicious, if not dangerous, right? And of course, the danger was protecting the enslavement regime that existed. Of course, white people in these organizations that are thinking about what they want, Black people are thinking about what they want. And so you see a series of conventions happening everywhere from Philadelphia to Richmond, right, in places where you have large populations of Black people who are talking about what they want to do. And some believed that immigration would be best, right? That while we don't want the ACS, the American Colonization Society, to pay for it, it might make sense to separate ourselves from the United States. And then there were others still who said, absolutely not, right? I think the overwhelming sentiment from these events, from these different conventions, because they're producing resolutions, et cetera, was that we don't want to leave because this is not our fault, right? Like, this is not something that we should have to sort of treat ourselves like a cancer and excise ourselves from the United States. We have sort of paid for our membership here through our blood, our sweat, and we cannot abandon other Black people and leave them and go to other parts of the world, that we have to stay here. And probably two of the biggest sort of titans of this moment, both Henry Highland Garnet and Frederick Douglass, were sort of on two sides of this conversation, right? I mean, Garnet in his 1843 address to the slaves of the United States urged rebellion and supported the idea of colonization, and went so far in 1859 to form his own African colonization society. His idea was that if we're going to leave the United States, it needs to be on our own dime, on our own steam, and when we decide to leave. And he actually ended up dying in Liberia. And Douglass, you know, the committed abolitionist that he was, didn't see immigration as really being desirable, right? Because Black people aren't the problem, and to leave, he suggests, would be sort of ceding to an idea that America belongs to white people, though Black people built it. And he said, we still have to fight for the enslaved, and there's really no place to do that but in the United States. So they are both presenting really powerful arguments, both for and against colonization, right? And the realization, right, from Garnet and others like him who argued that Black people should leave, it was that the United States was becoming a more and more dangerous place, right? That every time Black people sort of assert themselves, you see these sort of white backlash, right? So you get more restrictive Black codes, you get more violence meted out to Black communities, and that for those Black people who are even free, like he and Douglass, it's still too dangerous, because you could be pressed back into enslavement, because there are not many places where one can actually live and put together a life and hope, right, to have some sort of life unmolested, right, by the vagaries of racism. And on the other hand, you have Douglass, who was suggesting that this is too important, right, that as egregious as the behavior that we see, that is dangerous as the behavior that we see, we can't leave, right? And that even if we left, what are we going to get in the colonies but more sort of white rule? Because this is being subsidized by white organizations who don't believe in the full humanity of Black people. So colonization isn't really going to address that. But I want to make it clear that repression that these folks are experiencing is not just a Southern phenomenon, and it's not just happening in quote unquote slave states. This here is a picture of Jon Jones, who was one of the wealthiest Black men in the state of Illinois. He was from North Carolina and immigrated to Illinois, and made it his sort of personal campaign to end the Black laws of the state of Illinois, right? In part because one of the things that was happening in places like Illinois and Ohio, but as well as, you know, faraway states like Oregon, when they finally become states, but those territories, was this sort of banning of free Black people. And not only were these places not allowing Black people to offer testimony and all that kind of stuff, they were some of the first places with what we would call loitering laws. They were forcing Black people to pay taxes to stay, potentially threatening them with forced labor, right? So this was a dangerous country, right? It wasn't just a Southern problem, it was an American problem. As Malcolm X said, anything south of Canada is the South. And so we see it in Illinois and other spaces, Indiana, right, that were free states, that were becoming even more restrictive to Black people. So even the places that were quote free states that Black people had been able to struggle to, from Kentucky and Mississippi and Alabama, were saying, we don't want you here. And of course, we know about the varying fugitive slave laws that were enacted throughout the 18th and into the 19th centuries, right? Where the first sort of iteration of this in 1793, you were allowed to search for fugitives within the borders of free states. And if anyone was caught helping the escapees, there would be a $500 penalty, right? And of course, they become even more punitive with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled people to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved persons, denied enslaved people jury trials, and raised the penalty for those who would assist their escape. And this appeared in country and around the country, Maryland, Virginia, New York, right, throughout the 18th and into the 19th century, basically to prevent Black people from fleeing bondage, right? I mean, even our own Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, stated that escape didn't make you free. And I think those are important kinds of things to note, because these aren't just about state actors, these aren't just Southern actors, these are about a national sort of propping up of an institution and the exclusion of people, right? And of free people in particular, but people who are not necessarily citizens, right? So you have Black people being pushed actively, not just within the country to find a space for themselves, but even thinking we have to look beyond the United States because this place is becoming too dangerous for free Black people. So Martin Delaney is another sort of key figure here. I mean, he is, raised a free person and very much involved in sort of the war effort during the Civil War in the US. But he was one of the first to tell people, or one of the earliest voices to tell folks that they need to think about going somewhere else, right? And that if there's any place to go, right, it's open, right? And he really wanted to go back to the western part of Africa, but he actually lived in Canada for several years and came back to the United States only upon the Civil War. And he is not unlike others who really saw the world, right, as a possibility. So while Delaney is telling people, go to Mexico if you can get to Mexico, go to the Caribbean if you can get to the Caribbean, go to anywhere really that is going to let you be free, Canada became sort of the early staging ground, right? The first groups being the Loyalists, post the American Revolution, who helped the British, were sort of given passage to Canada because of their involvement in the war effort. There was another group of refugees who fled the US to escape and settled in Canada. And so during the antebellum period, they guess that between 10 to 30,000 Black people arrived in Canada from various parts of the United States. And the Book of Negroes has a pretty good listing of those Black people who left and went to Canada. And probably the biggest sort of champion of Canada is Marion Shad, who later became Marion Shad Carey. She married a man in Canada. But Marion Shad, also a Howard Law School alum, was born free, was an abolitionist, and her whole family moves to Canada eventually, but she moves in 1850. And she starts publishing this newspaper called the Provincial Freeman, which was the first female edited, first African-American woman edited paper in North America, excuse me, I can't talk. But she started publishing this in 1853 after sort of Delaney's remarks. But she also wrote a text encouraging Black people to come to Canada, and was not just considering Canada, she also considered Mexico and other climes. Her goal was to see Black people be close enough to the US to still advocate on behalf of Black people who were enslaved there and who could come in and out of the country. But her other thing was that Black people need to be someplace where they can live, where they can work, where they can feed themselves and their families, and be able to be free of the threat of being enslaved at any moment, on the word of whomever, because as we know, there were lots of people who were not fair dealers, right? And we're just saying that Black people were their property. And so when she publishes her plea for immigration, or Notes on Canada West, in 1852, this was sort of the precursor to the paper, and was using her sort of influence and her pamphlet to really guide Black people to settling in Canada, right? And giving them information about what the weather was going to be like, etc. And her big sort of, I think, intervention was telling people why Canada was preferred to other parts of the world, in particular the continent of Africa, right? And her main thing was tropical disease is killing Black people. We are not prepared for the climate. And so if we go, as other Black people had done previously, right? Paul Cuffey took some people at the start of the 19th century, we will likely die in those spaces. So we need to go somewhere that's a little bit more like what we're used to. And her advocacy for this kind of immigration really made her controversial. But she was very much well received because of her sort of commitment and her authenticity in telling Black people what was possible. Right. So these are the sort of different movements of Black people at different points in time around this sort of area between the US, Canada, the continent, and even parts of the West Indies, the Caribbean. And I think it's important to show that, in part because I think we have this idea that the routes were not as well worn or acknowledged, at least I'm saying as political scientists, right? That these Black people were moving very early across and back and forth to the US and Canada. And it was important, I think, because you still had Black people who had settled, say, like in Nova Scotia, and still decided that they needed to go to the continent, right? And they estimate that around 5,000 or so Black people left Canada for Sierra Leone over time. And I just show that here because I think it's important that we think about Black people as being agentic and using movement as possibility. And so I wanted to stop sort of in this space because I don't have sort of any sort of final thoughts. But I think it's important to note that Black people are employing the language of international human rights as early as the 18th and 19th century, when there is yet not a framework, right, of international human rights organization. That Black people are self-consciously talking about themselves as immigrants and using that as part of their lexicon to describe what they are as stateless people. And I think it's worthwhile to think about this because I think we need to see and more critically engage with immigration as a viable political strategy for Black people. It's something that they did for themselves. And I even think when we talk about the Great Migration or the exoduster periods, setting that within this larger, I think, human rights context, this language of refugee, this language of statelessness is really important because I think it puts Black people in a larger context of people in need of care and people who are seeking asylum and refuge, even from their own country, even within their own country. And that as political scientists, I want us to think more broadly about how Black people talk about themselves and their awareness around these terms and how grabbing onto the availability of these terms like refugee, like statelessness, opens up opportunities for Black people, in this context, Canada, but just opens up more ways for us to think about it as political scientists, or us to think about Black experiences as political scientists. Is not just being solely domestic, right? And when we talk about Black Americans, recognizing that Black Americanness is not tethered necessarily to America in the way that we appreciate for other groups of people of African descent. So with that, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for the talk. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function to share your questions. So I will give you a couple of minutes for that. Since you mentioned Brexit at the beginning of your comments, I remembered hearing people talk about sort of how it might be possible to get to Canada sort of in the wake of the 2016 election. But the truth is that Canada actually has really restrictive sort of immigration laws and asylum sort of policies and quotas that would have actually prevented a mass exodus of Americans to North if they would have wanted to do so. So when do Canada's more restrictive immigration policies go into effect, and was race at all part of sort of the narrative of sort of why Canada became more parsimonious with its immigration and asylum policies?
No, I heard the first part of it, so I didn't hear the actual question, but I heard the front part of it.
Yeah, so, the Canada of today is one that has actually more restrictive immigration policies than even the US does. So despite all that chatter in November 2016 about people leaving, there was no way that the Canada was going to receive all of those people and let them stay. So when did Canada's immigration policies become more strict, and did race have anything to do with that?
Well, I would say like a lot of places, I mean, the country has had its fair share of racial problems. Let me be clear. These Black people are not living in a panacea in Canada, right? They talk about being hungry. They talk about the fact that Native Canadians, white Canadians, not Indigenous Canadians, excuse me, are racist to them and don't want them to thrive, right? That they've given them some really poor plots of land, that it's cold, the land is hard. So Black people are struggling here too, but because Canada is so vast and unpopulated, they can kind of live relatively separately. But we look at places like Afriqueville, right, in different provinces that have been essentially obliterated or damaged, right, by governmental policy. I don't know when the exact moment was when Canada changed, but it's certainly been, I would say, a 30, 40 year sojourn, right, to becoming more restrictive. Because as you know, you can't, for example, go to Canada and seek refugee status. You have to do that outside of the country and hope that they let you in. And we've sort of adopted Canada's more restrictionist policy, right? So I don't have an exact date. I think though the idea of Canada then, you hit the nail right on the head, is very different. And I think absolutely, like everything else, it's connected to race. You have Indigenous people making claims against the government for their poor treatment, for the usurpation of their culture and their land. You have Black folks coming, not just from the US, but the Caribbean, right, who are now pushing Canada to become better than it was. You have Asian populations. So certainly, I think Canada and Canadians are as invested in sort of their identity as a white country as every place else. And so it does fall away, I think, in fairly short order. I think the thing to note is you stop seeing Black American immigration into Canada pretty much after 1865, right? So you have a lot of Black people who want to come support the war effort, like Marion Shad, like Garnet, and others who come back to the US because they are playing some integral roles in the Civil War. And then you have a lot of Blacks that say, okay, well, the war is over. I may not be wedded here, so I'll go back. But then there are some who kind of go back and forth, right, with the border. So I think this is a moment in time, and it's sort of like, who's the better of the worst, right? Because it's not like Canada is doing a bang up job when it comes to race.
And in terms of settlement and preservation of historic Black settlements, does that vary provincially? Does it vary by language? So for instance, is Quebec's policy different than say Ontario's? Does it also vary politically speaking, where you might sort of see something that looks a little bit different in like Alberta, for instance, you know, which is more conservative than say British Columbia or Quebec or Ontario?
Yeah, I think it really does depend. I will say part of what I think has happened and what has been really important, at least from my vantage point, right? It's not like I study all of these settlements in great deal, sorry, has been the Black communities there sort of pushing back against their erasure, right? As Canadians and as having sort of claim to Canada. So I'll talk about Afriqueville because that's the one I probably spent the most time thinking about in Nova Scotia. And it's really a sad kind of state of affairs because you just look at how that community was just neglected, right, by the Canadian government. Infrastructure, I mean, just basic things that make communities function were just gone. And then you have the government raise the community, right? And this is a community that had been there, you know, for a century. And you have a government just said to say, it doesn't matter. And what ended up happening is you had the folks of that community and their descendants push the government to acknowledge and to recognize. And I think you find that more often than not, that if the government was left on its own, they probably wouldn't acknowledge Black Nova Scotians at all, right? And the same thing when you're looking at Black folks who inhabit other parts of the country, Vancouver, right? Much smaller, but still, if you don't have any sort of, I would say, local Black pressure, the government is not really doing a good job of sort of organizing and preserving these organizations, these communities, excuse me. So you definitely have a number of Black organizations that have popped up across the country to make the government acknowledge and preserve, even if it's placards, because some of these communities are just gone. Acknowledge that Black folks were there and that Black folks settled you know, some really hard parts of these. I mean, Canada's a pretty rough terrain, and you have Black folks doing that work. And so I think it's gotten better. It's still not perfect. And I think you could ask a number of people who would say, you know, Canada has some blind spots where its own racisms are concerned. I think they think of themselves as better than, say, the Americans, right? But they are not doing a bang up job. And only because Black Canadians in Ontario, in all these different places are pushing, are these kinds of preservations of settlements sort of happening.
Thanks. Leslie Goto Solo asks, first, thanks you for your informative comments, and asks, have you conducted any research on the trend happening now for African-American women to resettle in places such as France, Mexico, Ghana, and their reasons for immigrating?
I haven't. I think that's some really fascinating work because I actually know a couple of people who've done that in the last 2 years for a number of reasons, right? Some of it is pace of lifestyle, cost of living, but it's also the racial and other climate of the United States that people just like, I don't want to deal with this. And I don't know if these places are much better, right? I mean, France and has its own travails, Mexico, certainly, if, you know, connecting this back to the conversation we had before our meeting, how they treated Haitians, for example, in Mexico has been pretty horrendous. But that said, I think, you know, these are important trends to keep in mind. And I also think, you know, thinking about the sort of class parts of this, because who can leave who has the money to leave. It's a little bit different. And we know the immigration regimes in a lot of these countries you list very much favor highly educated people who can contribute, right? Because labor becomes part of how we think about who's worthy of being able to leave. And they're leaving under a slightly different set of circumstances. One, in that they have citizenship and they're not necessarily considered stateless people. So they wouldn't be in the same sort of condition of being a refugee or considering themselves to be people without a country. But I think the idea that I have to leave is very real, right? Across sort of class and status. And, you know, it's been really, I think, interesting to see how some countries have sort of capitalized on that for various reasons, right? Whether they're facing population issues, whether they're facing issues of having sort of the skilled workforce, whether they're facing, other kinds of choices, right? Like they just want to make different choices. Like, hey, listen, we need to have people living in these villas in this part of Northern Italy that nobody wants to live in anymore. Like, let's encourage people to come. But there's still, I think, a pretty self-selecting group. And I would say this was too, but I think people's desire to move and to leave was sort of conditioned, right, by the government's lack of willingness, right, to allow them the most basics, right? Because these people weren't asking for a lot. They were asking for basic things like, I don't know, citizenship, the right to vote, can I serve on a jury, right? Like nobody was asking for, plots of land and all the things that we know the United States certainly had the wherewithal to do, right? And so I think there are some interesting parallels between sort of what we see in the contemporary moment and what we see in these previous moments. I actually think what might be more akin to what I was seeing there, even though, again, these are not people who are stateless or without citizenship, is sort of the reverse migration that we're seeing now, where you have Black people going back to the South, where you have Black people leaving cities, right? And in some cases, those movements are predicated on the sort of economic situation just being so difficult for people to navigate and manage that they sort of have to, right? People leaving New York, leaving California, going to Atlanta, right? Going to Charlotte and places that look a little bit more financially doable so they can put together a life that they would want. But it's also not clear that these people all want to leave. It's just sort of the economics of it makes sense. I mean, I live in DC, or used to, but I couldn't afford to stay in DC. So yes, I'm not being pushed out per se, but I'm being pushed out, right? The prices, the economics of home ownership in that city make it such that it's dang near impossible for most regular middle-class folks to live, even Black people who have less capital, less ability to gain housing finance. So I'm wondering if, that's what this makes me think about, that sort of gentrification. We also talk about that displacement. I know y'all experiencing this in Atlanta right now, right? With these communities that traditionally were inhabited by Black folks just become so expensive that people can't live there. And so they move to the suburbs, or they move to other parts of the city that might be a little far removed, have fewer services, fewer green spaces, all the things that make that place desirable, because they don't really have a lot of choice. And so I think about sort of maybe those being more the usual, perhaps, or more like the situation that I'm thinking about, where people just sort of don't have any control over sort of what's happening and therefore need to relocate and go to these heavily Black places that also offer mobility.
Thanks. Peter Wakefield, thanks you for the presentation and notes that you have very interesting closing points about statelessness as a condition, even an ongoing condition of Blacks in the US. My question, however, is about those who advocated immigration to Sierra Leone, for example. Were such advocates in communication with people in Sierra Leone? Who were their interlocutors in the destination countries? And what was the nature of any such discussions?
That's a great question. So I would say on the first part, the program to Sierra Leone really was largely organized by whites, right? And then taking, the formerly enslaved or people who were born free there. The problem, of course, has been, and traditionally have been, that no, there wasn't a lot of conversation actually between the Black Americans who were going and the native born folks who were there, right? Because Sierra Leone becomes created, right? It's a colony that is made. That engenders all kinds of problems and issues, in part because the jurisdiction, right, is still British, so it's not local control. And where you see the decolonization happen, there ends up being, I think, a lot of tug of war over who this country belongs to, right? Because you have these people creating the colony to serve these formerly enslaved persons, but without any real consideration for the native people who were already there and how they would be incorporated or not. And it's created, I think, some real difficulties, whether we talk about Sierra Leone or even Liberia, right? Where we've seen the sort of devolution of these relationships, in part because you have these sort of settler folks coming and who are coming with their own set of preconceived ideas about who they are and who the natives are, in no real sense of sort of how this place came to be in the same way, right? And I'm not saying that these people are ignorant, but this idea that, hey, there are other people who've been living here, right? And what can we learn from what sort of happened to them? And how do we become a unified country, or think of ourselves as fellow country people, right? Because we're coming from the US with this very particular experience, and these folks were sort of born here and had to live through the creation of this colony. So I didn't get a real sense, and I must say, I wasn't necessarily looking for the sort of communication between the sort of local Sierra Leoneans and Black colonists, or what do you call it, immigrants. Oh, goodness, I can't talk. But certainly there was definitely a lot of growing pains, and a lot of the conversation was really from Black folks writing back to tell people this is what it's like, this is what it's not like. But I didn't get any real sense that Black people were, okay, we're going to go to this place and let's start with sort of the Native community and having conversations with one another about how to do this. It's certainly, I think, created some hard feelings over time, and I think we see them bubble up in different kinds of ways. But I didn't spend a lot of time on that, unfortunately.
Thanks. Nick Bloom asks, how do you see the pre-Civil War immigration movements that you discuss here as connected to or distinct from the immigrationist movements that would emerge in the early 20th century, like Garveyism?
That's a great question. And I think Garvey was very much influenced by a lot of this conversation because, he's an immigrant himself. But also, these are people, some of these are people that he sort of looks up to, styles himself like. Even though I think, Garvey is certainly a man apart in his own way, the idea of Africa for the Africans, right? That notion is not news by the time he comes around. So I think he appealed to people who may have already been primed to think about some of this, because these are ongoing conversations. And one of the things that I was really sort of enthralled by, like, dang, this is a really long lineage of conversation Black folks are having. It's not like an unbroken conversation, but it's like a conversation that's perennial. I mean, we're still having the conversation, right, about whether we can stay in the United States, whether the United States is actually possible for us to be free. And I think Garvey is picking up on that thread and offering, again, Black people something that looks viable. We're going to get these votes and we're going to go to these places. Now, I do think one of the big distinctions between perhaps Garvey and some of these precursors is the sort of religious aspect of it. And Garvey's mission is not just political, it's also religious. And he views this as a proselytizing sort of mission. So he's going to go sort of teach the natives. And, that's one of the things that I don't know that we talk about enough when we talk about Garveyism, because Garvey has a very particular idea about who he thinks African people are. And I'm just saying Africans, like a whole continent of people, right? I mean, he very much sees Christianity as part of that message. So he's not only named himself like supreme potentate of Africa, the whole continent, he also sees himself and his movement and the people in his movement as going there to save souls. So I don't think the religion part was not necessarily as connected. And of course, there were people who were like Reverend Holly, who goes to Haiti, and he certainly talks about, Christianity some and bringing that. But I don't know if it's as prominent a part of their message in this pre-Civil War period as it is in Garvey's message post-Civil War, where it is very clear he needs to save these heathens. And he essentially uses this language. I mean, it's one of those things I think about Garvey that we like to gloss over, but he certainly does not see all Black people the same way. I mean, he sees African people who may not be Christianized as needing to be brought to heel and brought into the church. So, I mean, but he's one manifestation of it. I think if you go down the line, right, and you have, varying proposals, right, for Black people to either go to Africa, go create their own nation state. It's all, I think, part and parcel of this same idea that this country is not going to give Black people a fair shake. So whatever we have to do, separation, full leaving, is what we ought to do. And you see it crop up time after time. I just think the difference is the fact that people have official status, right? You have official status as a citizen. You have something to sort of trade with, if you will. And I think the other part of it that seems to me to be the same is the sort of real wrestling, right? That, yeah, people have a critique of the United States. People don't think the United States is a plain dealer, but they still don't, I mean, they were born here. Their families are here. Their communities are here. Do we really want to leave? Because I think there are lots of people who thought about leaving, but it's like, I gotta leave my mama. I can't bring, my cousins, my aunties. Like, I would have to go by myself. And when you read some of these stories of people who've been in exile, like Robert Williams, Radio Free Dixie, I mean, when you read these stories of what exile is like, even if you choose it, and it's not really a choice, right? He has to go. Assata Shakur has to go. There's still a lot of real pain in having to make that choice. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's what I sort of think about when I think about some of these other ones. I just talked about Garvey because you mentioned it.
Well, thank you for this. So the next question, and Nick says it was a great answer, and thank you. The next question is from Kez Robinson, and it's somewhat related. What are your thoughts on the role of Black religion and Black religious leaders in the past Black immigration efforts, not just in terms of Christians, but also Muslims and Black Hebrew Israelites? What were the successes and what were the missteps?
So I would say I don't know much about the Black Hebrew Israelites. What I know is what I see in DC and Philly, where they read Bible verses and scream at people. But I mean, it certainly has been the case that we've seen these groups do more or less advocating. I would say where like the Nation of Islam has been concerned, they had certainly been, I would say not less political, but certainly less involved in the world, right, if you will, right? So they're very much about creating a space for themselves and being fairly self-contained and self-supporting within the confines, right, of this space, but not as much I saw, as players in this conversation at this time. It's also still fairly young as a movement in the place. I'm looking in the 19th century. It's not really a thing yet. In terms of the Hebrew Israelites, I don't know much about them. I know that there were some who I think have sought formal relationship with the state of Israel, I think. But I don't know that that's actually sort of worked out. I would say the only thing I can think of is the Nation of Yahweh, which is Black Hebrew Israelites, but I think a slight offshoot, who had kind of developed a sort of compound, as it were. But I don't know that organization is necessarily the same, in that they had, I would say, a religion that brought them more inward facing rather than outward facing, if that makes sense. So their idea of how they would create nations were really for other believers, and that those nations would be maybe within the United States or within the confines of the United States, but only for them, right? So their compounds are very much inward facing. It's not attached to, I would say, a larger liberatory message for all Black people. It's a liberatory message if you are a follower of this particular religious practice, but not necessarily a message of freedom for all Black people that happens to be touted by a religious person, but doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a congregant or a follower or a believer, if you will. So I don't know if that helps, but I find that some of those groups tend to look a little to retract, right? To bring their message inward and only for believers and not to this broader community of Black folks.
The next question is from Derek Handley, who I would want to point out is a GWJI alum. Derek says, thank you for this wonderful presentation. In your research, did you come across any stories of Black people in the 19th century who immigrated to Africa, but then returned to the United States?
I didn't. I'm trying to remember the woman's name. She and her husband did immigrate, and they did live. Because it was at a time when I think it was either a yellow fever or a cholera outbreak when they went. But she and her husband worked for, I can't think of the guy's name, and I know where I have her name somewhere. It's going to kill me. I'm going to probably think about it when it's over. And they did write letters back, basically saying that they were doing well. I didn't see many people who came back and forth, although Garnet did go to Liberia and I think come back at different points. I think Reverend Holly, he went to Haiti, and I think he stayed for the most part. I didn't see a lot of people coming back and forth from Africa. Canada, yes. But I'm sure those people are out there. I'm sure they exist. I didn't necessarily look for them, but I think, the real truth of it is just the distance and the difficulty of the journey. And then also the likelihood of people dying of disease. That was sort of the big thing. I think Paul Cuffey goes and comes back. But I don't remember reading specifically what he said about his time and why. But I think the expense and the distance is probably why you don't see as much of that, but I'm certain it happened. I didn't personally run across any of it.
So let me make a final call for questions if you have them. And while we wait for those questions, you have discussed this project as being sort of picking up where you left off with your previous book, and some of this content was stuff that just did not fit in the first book. So for those who are unfamiliar with the argument in the evidence in your book, American While Black, can you provide like a brief synopsis of sort of what your argument and key findings were?
So my basic argument is that Black people understand immigration through a very Black and white lens. And what looks like critiques of immigrants and immigration are really critiques of white supremacy and how it uses sort of immigrant groups as a cudgel, right, against Black folks. That's sort of my argument. And so I do sort of a historical kind of chapter, which looks at some of this, right? Black people talking about movement and really trying to place Black people in the center of sort of immigration conversations, because we usually talk about Black people like Johnny come latelys, like the only people that understand immigration are, you know, folks from the continent of Africa or folks from the Caribbean and other parts of the world where Black people might live, but not Black Americans themselves. And my argument is this is not the first time Black people have had this conversation. They've been having this conversation for a really long time. And then I used Durham, North Carolina as a case study. That's where I did my dissertation work, but it was also important for me to ground the book in the South, because I think we often talk about immigration as a Northern issue that like the South has no sort of relationship to it, even though at the time, North Carolina's immigration population had increased by 400% between 1990 and 2000, right? It was exploding and these non-traditional immigrant gateways were popping up all across the South. So it was important for me to make this a Southern story, because I feel it's like that's the home. When I think about sort of Black thinking and theorizing, I think about the South. And I use interviews there to show that, you know, what might look like on a survey as hostility toward immigrants, like people thinking people take jobs or people have access to loans and stuff that Black people don't get access to, is really this larger critique of how Black mobility in this country has been thwarted on multiple dimensions over time. And then the last sort of part, I used a survey that I did with a colleague of mine where we looked at 1,000 whites, 1,000 Blacks, and we asked people about, you know, what groups that they have the most affinity for. And with Black people, they have the most affinity for other non-white people, even if they are immigrants. And what I'm really trying to show here is that Black people aren't hostile to immigration. Black people are hostile to white supremacy, but it's a lot easier perhaps to frame that around immigrants and immigration, because that's a lot easier to wrap your hands around than a notion like white supremacy, which is sort of, I mean, we're in a moment of official colorblindness. It doesn't exist, right? And Black people have used this kind of as a way to make the argument for their own inclusion. And they use their citizenship, however tenuous, to make the argument for their own inclusion. And that's sort of the book in a nutshell.
Thank you. That was great synopsis of the book. Your ears may have been burning on Thursday night, but your co-author, Janelle Wong, was on an evening panel for us on Thursday where she mentioned your new article on Black attitudes towards immigration. Would you mind just sharing some of those findings as well?
Yeah, so the new piece we look at is really trying to understand why is it that Black people seem to demonstrate more progressive ideas about attitudes toward immigration than Asian Americans do. And, you know, this was a hard one to write because some ways we're theorizing about things that we've not really studied before. And so we don't know, but part of what we get to is this idea that Black people just have a notion about self-determination that sort of spills over into these other domains. And when we're looking at sort of groups that are sort of more immigrant identified, right, who are closer to this issue of immigration, we see like maybe this distancing effect is happening, right, where people are still trying to do some like image management, right? And it's like, we don't want to be associated with those people, right? Those bad people who break the rules, right? Who don't come in through the usual means, all that kind of stuff. And we largely think it's about a self-preservation, because people recognize that the political climate is not open. The political climate is not really here for immigrant groups, and people know this and recognize this. And so what they're trying to approximate is an attitude that they think is in the general population, so that they are not maligned themselves and are not excluded. And Black people don't necessarily have those same sentiments when it comes to immigration. And we think that has to do with sort of people's attitudes about these institutions, Black people's attitudes about these institutions more generally, which they know all too well are harmful to their communities. So that's sort of how we came up with that paper. And that was just a fluke of a finding. We were using the CMPS, and we noticed it's like, wait, Black people are more supported. Why is it? And so that's sort of how we came together on this particular piece.
Great. Thank you so much for those synopses. So I don't see any more questions. So I know, Dr. Carter, you cannot see our applause, but I'm sure that it is there from everybody's desks and from their home offices. So we just want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for being here. Before we close for today, I do want to remind people, again, if you want to have a scholarly discussion about Black love, please feel free to tune in to the Faculty Spotlight webcast with Diane Stewart, available on YouTube. And then I want to invite you to next week's colloquium, where our speaker will be Dr. Brandon Winford of the University of Tennessee, and his topic is going to be on Black banking in the South. So with that, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.